Some cases close quietly, the paperwork gets filed, the headlines fade, life, relentless and indifferent, moves forward. And the people left behind learn slowly, painfully, never completely, how to carry something that will never fully release them. This was not one of those cases. The name Nancy Guthrie may not mean anything to you right now. That is about to change. Because what happened to her, and more importantly, what has only recently begun to surface about what happened to her, is the kind of thing that stops you. That makes you sit back and reconsider what you thought you understood about how justice works, about who gets believed, about what gets buried, and about the specific, quiet decisions that determine whether the truth ever sees daylight. For years, this case lived in that painful in-between space. Official conclusion on one side, private doubt on the other. The authorities had their version, the people who loved Nancy had theirs. And the distance between those two versions was wide enough that the questions never fully disappeared, they just stopped being asked out loud. They went underground. They became the thing that got carried in silence at dinner tables and in late-night conversations that never went anywhere. Until now, because something new has emerged, not a rumor. Not the kind of speculation that gets dressed up as evidence when people are desperate for answers. According to reports, what has surfaced is being described by those following this case closely as genuinely significant. The kind of development that does not simply add texture to an existing picture, but calls the picture itself into question. The kind of detail that, if it holds under examination, does not just complicate the official account, it could dismantle it. What that detail is, how it came to light, and what it means for every person still connected to this case. That is the story being told here. Stay with it, because nothing about what follows is simple, and nothing about it should be. To feel the true weight of what has recently come to light, you first have to understand who Nancy Guthrie actually was. Not the name in the file, not the subject of an investigation, but the person, the living, present, irreplaceable human being who existed before any of this began. Nancy Guthrie lived a life that did not draw attention to itself. She was not a public figure. Her name had never appeared in a newspaper before any of this started. She was, by every account from the people who knew her, a woman who moved through her world with quiet intention, someone whose presence registered not loudly but deeply. The kind of person whose absence, when it eventually came, left a specific and irreplaceable kind of emptiness, not the abstract grief of losing someone you knew distantly. The particular physical grief of losing someone whose voice you can still hear, whose habits you still expect to encounter, whose place at the table still feels wrong when it is empty. The people who loved her do not describe that absence in sweeping terms. They describe it in small ones, the things she used to say in ordinary moments. The way she paid attention when you were speaking to her, really paid attention, in a way that made you feel like what you were saying mattered. The rituals of an ordinary shared life that only become visible, that only become precious once they are permanently gone. That absence in time became a case. And like many cases built around people who do not come from positions of social visibility or institutional power, it moved through the system in ways that answered some questions while quietly producing others, leaving the people who loved Nancy with a feeling that the official process, whatever its intentions, had not fully finished what it started. According to reports, the circumstances surrounding what happened to Nancy Guthrie were more complicated from the very beginning than early accounts acknowledged. The initial version, the one that formed the foundation of official conclusions, was accepted publicly, at least on the surface, for a period of time. But there is a significant difference between public acceptance and private resolution. And the people who knew Nancy best, who understood the specific details of how she lived and who she was, never crossed from one to the other. They kept asking, not always loudly, not always through channels that anyone in a position to act was paying attention to, but persistently, the way people keep asking when they know, somewhere beneath the reach of what can be formally proven, that the explanation they have been given does not match the person they knew. Grief is not a reliable instrument. Anyone who has experienced sudden, unexplained loss understands how it can distort perception, how it can make the ordinary appear suspicious and the explainable appear sinister. That is a real and important caution, but grief can also do something else. It can sharpen attention in ways that are not easily dismissed. It can make the people who loved someone notice the small, specific things that the people processing a case quickly and moving on to the next one might genuinely fail to see. The people close to Nancy were noticing things, And for a long time, the institutions built to investigate those things were not listening. That is the real beginning of this story. Not the new detail that comes later, and when it does, it changes everything. The beginning is here, in the years of a family carrying questions inside a system that had already decided, with confidence that would eventually prove to be premature, that it had found the answers. Before any of this became what it became, there was just a life being lived, fully, ordinarily, without any indication of what was coming. That is the thing that institutional processes are not designed to capture, and almost never do, the texture of who a person actually was before the event that redefines how the world will forever categorize them. Nancy Guthrie was not, and should not be, reducible to what happened to her. She was a person who held her relationships with genuine care. She was attentive in the specific way that some people are, the kind of attentiveness that notices when something is shifting in the people around you, often before those people have named it themselves. She did not perform that care, she did not require recognition for it. She offered it through presence and through the steady, unremarkable consistency of someone who simply shows up day after day as themselves. She had built something. A life with real dimensions, family, community, the small repeated patterns that give an ordinary life its private architecture. From any outside perspective, she was grounded, stable, moving forward in the way that people move forward when they have something to move toward. She was not someone standing at an edge. There was nothing in the visible record of her daily life that pointed toward what was coming. That is part of what made the aftermath so difficult for the people around her to navigate. When loss arrives with no warning and no clear cause, the mind goes searching for the moment that should have told you, the sign you missed. The detail that, if you had caught it, might have changed something. For the people who loved Nancy, that search found nothing because there was nothing to find. She had simply been there fully herself, and then she was not. The immediate aftermath held all the familiar shapes of sudden grief, the shock that makes the world feel slightly unreal. The strange experience of watching ordinary life continue around a loss that feels large enough to stop everything. The rituals, the gatherings, the words, the gestures, that exist not because they help, but because they are the only available response to something that has no adequate response. But even inside that grief, even in those first raw and disorienting days, something was already forming. A discomfort. A quiet but persistent sense, according to reports, that the official account beginning to take shape around what had happened to Nancy did not quite align with the woman the people who loved her had known. It was not dramatic. There was nothing to point to clearly and say, that is wrong and here is why. It was subtler than that, a low, consistent friction between the explanation being offered and the understanding those closest to her carried about who she was and how she lived. They held that discomfort carefully at first, out of respect for the process, out of the hope that the people whose job it was to find the truth would follow it wherever it led. That hope was reasonable. It was also, as it turned out, more fragile than it appeared. The official account took the shape that official accounts take. Statements were collected. Evidence was reviewed, conclusions were reached and documented. And then, in the way these processes work, the file moved toward closure, because closure is what institutional processes are built to produce. And because the machinery that handles cases like this one has too many cases and too few resources to remain indefinitely open to the possibility that its initial conclusions were incomplete. But the people closest to Nancy could not follow the file toward closure. They were not built for that. They were built for Nancy, and what they knew about her would not let them stop. According to reports, the concerns that began forming in the immediate aftermath did not diminish with time. They accumulated. The questions that started as the general, anguished inquiries of grief, was everything examined? Were the right people asked the right questions? Did the process work the way it was supposed to? Gradually became something more specific, more grounded in detail, less about the pain of loss and more about the particularity of what the record showed and what it conspicuously did not. According to reports, there were elements of the physical and circumstantial evidence that those following the case closely felt had not been pursued with the thoroughness the circumstances demanded. Aspects of what had happened and when examined carefully and with fresh eyes, produced questions the official version had not adequately addressed. Small inconsistencies, each of which could perhaps be explained away in isolation, but which accumulated into something harder to dismiss when seen together as a pattern. The challenge was not the questions themselves. The challenge was being heard, Families in this position occupy one of the most exhausting and isolating spaces that exist within the justice system. They are simultaneously in the depths of grief and trying to function as informal investigators of their own loss. Their emotional state makes it easy convenient, even for institutions to interpret their concerns as products of that grief, rather than as legitimate challenges to an official record that may be incomplete. The system is not designed, structurally or culturally, to readily accommodate the idea that it got something wrong. Reopening a closed case requires more than questions. It requires the kind of sustained, evidenced pressure that a grieving family working largely alone rarely has the resources to generate. According to reports, the family made efforts to bring their concerns through the channels that exist for exactly this purpose. Those efforts did not, for a long time, produce the re-examination they were asking for. The questions kept getting bigger. The audience for them stayed frustratingly, exhaustingly small. Until finally that began to change, the shift did not happen all at once. These things rarely do. What began, at some point that is difficult to identify precisely, was a gradual widening of the circle of people paying serious attention to the Nancy Guthrie case. Independent investigators, people who work outside the constraints and assumptions of official processes, who bring different methodologies and different questions to a record that official institutions have already categorized and moved past. Journalists who have spent careers examining the gap between what closed cases claim and what the underlying evidence actually supports. Legal professionals who understand, from long experience, what it looks like when a process has been completed versus when it has simply been concluded. These were people with distance from the grief, with no personal investment in any particular outcome, with the professional tools to look at a record and assess, without the distorting weight of love and loss, whether the conclusions it contained were as solid as they appeared. According to reports, what those assessments found was enough to sustain serious concern. The inconsistencies that Nancy's family had been identifying, the timeline questions, the evidence gaps, the aspects of the investigation that felt, to people who knew the territory, like they had been treated as less important than they deserved, did not dissolve under independent scrutiny. They proved to be present in the record itself, not merely in the interpretations of people whose grief made them want to find them. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant the questions were not products of emotional need. They were products of what the evidence actually showed and failed to show. According to reports, specific aspects of how the original investigation was conducted came under review, aspects that, when examined with fresh eyes and appropriate expertise, appeared to reflect a process that had moved toward conclusion more quickly than the complexity of the circumstances warranted. Whether that reflected something as common as insufficient resources, or something as troubling as institutional assumptions that shaped what got looked at and what did not, was not something that could be determined from the outside. But the result, a record with gaps significant enough to undermine genuine confidence in the conclusions drawn from it, was being described in similar terms by multiple observers with no connection to each other and no shared motivation beyond professional accuracy. When that kind of convergence happens, when people approaching a case from entirely different angles with different expertise and no shared agenda arrive at similar concerns, it becomes impossible to attribute those concerns to any single perspective or emotional state. The case was not just a family's private grief anymore. It was, to a growing number of serious observers, a case that appeared to have been closed before the work of closing it had been properly completed. And then, according to reports, something arrived that none of the previous examination had anticipated. Not a restatement of old questions, not a reframing of existing concerns. Something genuinely, materially new. A detail that had not appeared in any previous account, information that, if it proved to be what it appeared to be, had the potential not just to complicate the official version of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but to fundamentally challenge the ground it stood on. The conversation around the case shifted almost immediately. There are moments in cases that have been long unresolved, when a single new piece of information does something that years of accumulated questioning could not. It does not just add weight to what was already suspected. It changes the shape of everything that came before it, reframes it, reorders it, makes visible a structure that was always present but could not previously be seen clearly. According to reports, what has recently emerged in the Nancy Guthrie case is precisely that kind of development. The people with direct knowledge of the new detail have been measured in how they describe it publicly, in the careful way that people are measured when they understand the stakes of what they are handling. But according to reports, investigators and legal observers who have reviewed the relevant material have characterized it in terms that are difficult to minimize, as the kind of development that would, in any properly functioning process, demand formal and serious re-examination of what was previously considered a concluded matter. What the new information appears to do, and careful language matters here. Because no official conclusion has been reached and no formal proceedings have been announced, is introduce substantive questions about elements of the case that had been treated as settled. According to reports, it touches directly on aspects of the timeline and the surrounding circumstances that formed the core framework of the official account. If the detail is what it appears to be, then that framework is not as stable as it was presented. The foundation has a problem, and a foundation with a problem changes everything built on top of it. For the people who spent years asking questions that no one in authority seemed willing to seriously engage with, this development does not feel the way vindication is supposed to feel. Because vindication implies that the wrong has been corrected, and it has not been. What it actually feels like is more complicated and more painful than that. It feels like watching something you always knew move finally into a space where other people can see it too, which means confronting all over again what it cost to wait that long. What was lost in the years when the official record said there was nothing more to find, while the truth was apparently sitting somewhere, patient and undiscovered, waiting for someone to look in the right place. According to reports, people with legal expertise who have become aware of the new development are now engaged in discussions about what formal avenues are available and appropriate. No proceedings have been confirmed, no official reopening has been announced, but the ground has shifted in a way that is not easily shifted back. The possibility space has opened. And for the people who loved Nancy Guthrie, who have spent years holding a belief that the world around them consistently declined to validate, something is present now that was not present before. Not certainty, not resolution. Something smaller and more fragile than that, and in some ways more precious because of it. The belief that the truth, the actual and complete truth, might still be within reach. They are holding that belief carefully. Years of experience have taught them not to grip it too tightly. But it is there, and it is real, and it has not been there not like this for a very long time. To understand what the new detail actually means, what it means in full, beyond the immediate facts of its emergence, you have to be willing to sit with some uncomfortable questions about the systems that handled this case. About how cases like this one move through institutions. About the gap between what those institutions are supposed to do and what the record shows they actually did. Because Nancy Guthrie's story in its broader shape is not singular. The person at its center is singular, irreplaceable, specific, impossible to generalize. But the pattern the case follows is recognizable to anyone who has studied how justice operates in practice, as opposed to in principle. The pattern of a case reaching official closure before the examination that closure requires has been genuinely completed. The pattern of a family's concerns being filtered through institutional assumptions about grief and reliability, until those concerns become easier to dismiss than to address. The pattern of questions living for years in spaces too small and too private to generate the kind of pressure that formal processes require before they will reconsider their own conclusions. That pattern is not a failure unique to any one jurisdiction or any one set of individuals. It is, according to reports and legal observers who study these situations, a structural feature of how the system functions under the real conditions of limited resources, institutional inertia, and the very human tendency to trust the conclusions that have already been reached. The principle says case is close when the evidence supports closure. The reality says case is close when the pressure to conclude them exceeds the institutional capacity to continue examining them. Those two things are genuinely, significantly different. And the distance between them is where cases like Nancy's end up living, for months, for years. Sometimes for decades, while the people who love the person at the center pay the cost of that distance every single day. According to reports, the implications of what has emerged go beyond the specific facts of what happened to Nancy. They extend to questions about how those facts were officially characterized, about whether the process that produced that characterization met the standard it was obligated to meet. If the record is as incomplete as the new information suggests, then how that incompleteness came to exist is not a side question. It is one of the central questions. And it deserves the same serious attention as anything else in this case. For the people closest to Nancy, the psychological weight of this moment is not easy to describe. They have spent years in a particular kind of suspended state, holding the space between what they knew and what was officially acknowledged, carrying the doubt that the system kept asking them to put down. That is not a sustainable posture. It costs something real and ongoing to maintain it. It requires a kind of endurance that exhausts itself quietly, invisibly, in ways that never make it into any official record. They maintained it anyway. Not because they are exceptional people in any extraordinary sense, though what they have endured would be extraordinary for anyone. They maintained it because they knew Nancy. Because the intimacy of that knowledge made the official account feel insufficient every time they encountered it, no matter how many times they were asked to accept it and move on. That kind of knowledge, personal, lived, resistant to documentation, is not something that formal investigative processes are built to accommodate. It cannot be entered into evidence. It cannot be cross-examined, but it is real. And in this case, it pointed consistently and across years in a direction that the new detail now appears to confirm was the right one. Nothing has been resolved yet. No official conclusion has been reached. The formal processes that would need to engage meaningfully with what has emerged have not yet done so in any publicly confirmed way. What exists is a development, significant, according to reports, to the people best positioned to assess it, and a group of people receiving that development with the quiet, careful, hard-won caution of those who have learned that hope is a fragile instrument. But the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie is closer to the surface than it has ever been, and that matters. It matters in ways that go beyond this one case, and beyond this one family, and beyond this particular moment in a long and painful story that is not yet finished. What this story finally asks of us, beneath all the details, beneath the procedural weight of it, beneath the language of investigations and records and official conclusions, is something quieter and more fundamental than attention. It asks for witness, the capacity to stay present with a story that does not resolve cleanly, that does not offer the satisfaction of a clear ending or the relief of a verdict that lets you close the window and move on. The willingness to hold without flinching what it actually contains, a life that was real and full and mattered to the people who shared it, a loss that was never adequately explained. A family that kept showing up year after year in a system that kept looking past them and kept asking anyway. And now, at last, a development that suggests they were right to keep asking. That the questions they refused to put down were pointing toward something true. That is not a small thing to sit with. In a world that is structured around speed, around the next story, around the news cycle that rewards novelty over persistence and the dramatic over the sustained, the fact that people held this case together through years of unrewarded effort, through silence and dismissal, and the particular exhaustion of caring about something that the wider world had already moved past, deserves recognition that goes beyond whatever formal outcome eventually follows. Nancy Guthrie deserved better. She deserved a process that treated the circumstances of what happened to her as worthy of thorough, patient, rigorous examination, one that followed the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the inconvenience of what it found. Whether she received that process is now, because of what has recently emerged, a question that is being asked again with fresh urgency and new material to work with. According to reports, that re-examination is now being taken seriously by people with both the standing and the expertise to pursue it. No outcomes have been announced. No formal actions have been publicly confirmed. The situation remains, in the strict sense, unresolved. The full truth has not yet been established through any process that can make it official and final. But there is something happening, something that was not happening before. A truth moving incrementally closer to the surface, not with the speed or the certainty that Nancy's family deserved years ago, but moving. And in a case that has been this still for this long, movement carries a weight of its own. For the people who loved her, this moment is not celebratory. It is too loaded for that. It carries too much of what came before it, too many years of being told there was nothing to find, too many conversations that ended without resolution. Too much loss compounded by the secondary loss of not being believed. What they are feeling, according to those close to them, is something more like the particular stillness that comes when something you have been bracing against finally begins to give way. A careful, tentative easing of a tension that has been held for so long it had begun to feel permanent. They are not gripping this moment too tightly. They know better than that now. But they are holding it and they are watching. For the rest of us watching alongside them from a distance, the invitation is this: pay attention. Resist the pull toward the next story. Understand that the cases that do not resolve cleanly are not simply system failures to be noted and moved past. They are obligations. Questions that the system owes genuine answers to. And when new information surfaces that makes those answers newly possible, the right response is not fatigue. It is the same thing that Nancy's family offered across all those years, in the face of every closed door and every unanswered question: persistence, attention, and the quiet, unwavering refusal to let the truth stay buried simply because finding it was harder than leaving it alone. If this story reached you, if it made you think about the cases we set aside too quickly, about the families who keep asking long after the world has moved forward, about the fragile and important difference between a case that is closed and a case that is actually finished, take a moment and leave your thoughts in the comments. This kind of story deserves real conversation, not just views. If you believe that the people at the center of unresolved cases deserve more than a headline that fades, consider subscribing. We will keep following stories like Nancy's carefully, honestly, with the patience they deserve, because some truths take time. And the people waiting for them deserve to know someone is still watching.